The words landed like a stone thrown into still water. Barron Trump, leaning back in his chair with a kind of dismissive smirk that carried more arrogance than experience, looked across the stage and declared, "Jasmine Crockett is unfit." His tone wasn't just critical, it was dripping with entitlement. Each syllable meant to belittle rather than debate. For a split second, the room seemed to stop breathing. The cameras zoomed in. The anchors froze mid-gesture, caught between shock and awkward restraint. Somewhere in the studio, an audience member gasped loud enough to cut through the silence. It wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration. An attempt to strip away dignity in front of the nation. And then the camera caught her. Jasmine Crockett. Still composed. Her face didn't flinch, didn't fold, didn't even twitch with irritation. She simply held his gaze with the unshakable calm of someone who had weathered far worse storms than this one. Were Barron's sneer carried the weight of entitlement. Crockett's silence carried the weight of history, of struggle, of resilience forged in fire. The narrator's voice cut through the tension. This wasn't just a jab. It was arrogance colliding with resilience. It was a young man's attempt to diminish, crashing against the dignity of a woman who refused to be diminished. The audience shifted, restless. Some leaned forward, waiting for her to break. Others shook their heads, anger rising on her behalf. On social media, the clip was already being clipped, tweeted, replayed #unfit, trending within minutes. The word echoing like a challenge rather than an insult. And yet Crockett didn't rush. She didn't bite back with the fury that Barron seemed to expect. Instead, her silence became its own weapon. Her poise, a contrast that made his attack look smaller by the second. She let the tension build, let the cameras drink in the contrast, his smirk against her calm, his arrogance against her quiet authority, and then, with the faintest hint of a smile, Crockett reached down, her fingers brushing against a folder she had brought with her. The room held its breath. The narrator leaned in. But what Crockett did next with one recording left the entire room stunned. Barron Trump had grown accustomed to rooms bending around him. He carried himself like someone who believed criticism was beneath him, as if entitlement were a birthright rather than an accident of lineage. Following in his father's footsteps, he wore bravado like armor, louder, sharper, dismissive of anyone who dared challenge him. To Barron, the word unfit was a weapon, and he expected it to silence Jasmine Crockett on cue. But this wasn't just about a single exchange and a single debate. When he tried to dismiss Crockett with a single word, he wasn't only questioning her fitness, he was dismissing everything she represented. Crockett wasn't merely a congresswoman. She was a voice for people whose struggles didn't make headlines, for communities long told to sit down and be silent. For Barron, it was theater. For Crockett, it was about truth, representation, respect. The narrator's voice pressed into the moment by undermining Crockett. Barron Trump wasn't just throwing shade. He was insulting lived experience, mocking democratic values, and sneering at the idea that leadership should come from service rather than privilege. The stakes were suddenly clear. If arrogance went unchallenged, entitlement would define the stage. If Crockett's dignity held firm, she could flip the script not just for herself, but for everyone watching who had ever been told they were unfit for daring to step into rooms not built for them. The studio murmurs became part of the drama. On Twitter, the hashtags began to roll in. #unfit or unbesert sparked debate. Some mocked Barron's cheap insult. Others rallied behind Crockett's unshaken calm. Clips spread across TikTok with captions like, "This is what composure looks like." Instagram reels captured the still frame of her steady gaze, contrasted against his smug grin. What had started as a single insult was becoming a cultural moment in real time. Crockett, meanwhile, sat in the eye of the storm. To the casual viewer, her silence was just composure. But to those who knew her story, her roots, her resilience, her record it was something more. It was the confidence of someone who had receipts, who had lived proof of her worth that no insult could erase. And in that tension, that balance of arrogance versus authenticity, the entire room leaned forward. Barron thought he was playing the role of heir to a legacy of dominance. But Crockett was about to remind him that history doesn't always belong to the loudest. belongs to the ones who can prove it. The narrator's voice cut like a drumbeat. Barron thought it was just another insult. But this time, history had receipts. For most of his life, Barron Trump lived in the carefully constructed bubble of privilege. From the golden lobbies of Trump Tower to the shield of the Secret Service, every step of his upbringing was marked by protection, insulation, and the quiet hum of power surrounding him. When America first saw him, it was as the quiet child of a polarizing president. But as years passed, silence gave way to presence, soon turned into performance. Gradually, Barron began stepping into the arena his family had dominated. For decades, he didn't enter politics through the trenches of service, nor through the grind of public trust. Instead, he emerged through the spotlight podium appearances, carefully crafted interviews, and the inheritance of a brand that promised loyalty from one side of the nation and scorn from the other. His words, often sharp, carried the same cadence of dismissal his father had perfected, mocking critics, sneering at opponents, and presenting entitlement as if it were earned confidence. But the truth was always there. It's unspoken yet undeniable. Barron spoke of merit, yet his rise had nothing to do with meritocracy. He lectured others about hard work and worthiness, while standing on the scaffolding of his last name. His access to the microphone was not built by resilience, but by inheritance. He wore the language of strength and fitness like a costume because in reality, it had never been tested. Clips began to circulate over time. Barron brushing off questions with a smirk. Barron leaning into the microphone to sneer, "Some people just aren't cut out for leadership." Barron speaking of discipline, while his own path was paved with red carpets and exemptions. Each remark carried the same pattern: condescension without substance, confidence without grounding. The narrator's voice thundered. He inherited power, but not perspective. And that was the contradiction at the heart of his presence. For Barron, politics wasn't a calling, it was a stage, a platform where arrogance replaced authenticity, where entitlement dressed itself as authority. While others built their careers through service, sacrifice, and struggle, his path was framed by unearned applause and a legacy that told him he could not be questioned. But every stage has its test. Every performance has its reckoning. The question was simple. What happens when privilege collides with authenticity? When inherited arrogance stands toe-to-toe with lived resilience? Because standing across from Barron Trump was Jasmine Crockett, a woman whose very presence told a different story. Where he leaned on legacy, she leaned on experience. Where he mocked, she carried herself with quiet fire. And unlike him, she wasn't built to bow. Cliffhanger. And Jasmine Crockett was not built to bow, long before the cameras, before the bright lights of Washington, and before her name became a trending hashtag. Jasmine Crockett was simply a girl from Texas. She grew up in a working-class household where nothing was handed to her, where every opportunity was something she had to chase, fight for, and defend. The Crockett household was not lined with marble floors or gilded towers. It was lined with lessons about grit, faith, and dignity. Her parents taught her that struggle wasn't something to be ashamed of, it was something to build from. She watched neighbors piece together extra shifts to keep food on the table. She saw families worry about health bills more than vacations. And she lived what millions of Americans lived, the tightrope of survival. It was that reality that forged her fire. Crockett's story did not follow a path of inherited privilege. Instead, it was the kind of story that demanded persistence. Through sheer determination, she made her way into law school, walking into lecture halls where the odds whispered against her but never silenced her. There, surrounded by students who had been groomed for these spaces, she brought something. They couldn't live to authenticity. Her education wasn't an ivory tower pursuit. It was preparation for the fight she already knew she was stepping into when she earned her law degree. Crockett didn't turn toward corporate prestige or cushy offices. She turned toward the people who needed her most. Out in real courtrooms, on behalf of real people, tenants wrongfully evicted, workers cheated out of wages. Immigrants facing systems designed to exhaust them. She stood as their voice, their defense, their advocate when no one else would. Every legal brief she filed was more than paperwork, it was a lifeline. And unlike those who weaponize rhetoric for applause, Crockett understood what justice looked like in practice. She saw faces, not statistics. She knew that when you stand for marginalized communities, you are not simply arguing a case. You are fighting for dignity itself. The contrast to Barron Trump could not be sharper. Where his path was paved with last names and family networks, hers was clawed out of trenches no one else wanted to walk through. Where he leaned on smug entitlement, she leaned on sweat, resilience, and a voice that carried not just her own story, but the collective stories of those America too often leaves behind. She was not embarrassed of her roots. In fact, she wore them as her shield. For immigrant families who crossed oceans, for black and brown children told to lower their voices, for every working-class household that wondered if their kids would ever climb out, Crockett was proof that you could come from struggle and stand tall in the halls of power. Narrator, this wasn't just a congresswoman. This was a daughter of struggle, a voice forged in fire. And that is why Barron's insult landed differently. To mock Jasmine Crockett as unfit was not simply to belittle a person, was to dismiss the millions of Americans whose lives and dreams mirrored hers. It was to sneer at resilience, to diminish lived experience, to insult the very communities that built this nation through labor, sacrifice, and hope. But Crockett wasn't shaken. Because her strength was not constructed from applause or family legacies, it was built from every courtroom she walked into and every client she defended against the odds. When arrogance tried to undermine her, she had something far more powerful than bravado. She had the truth, and truth, once spoken, has a way of silencing even the loudest rooms. Cliffhanger. And when he called her unfit, she answered with truth carved from her journey. The insult had already landed, but Barron wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, smirk still plastered across his face, his voice rising just enough to carry through the studio. Unfit, he repeated, with the kind of condescension that only comes from someone who has never once been questioned about their own worth. He rolled the word like it was a punchline, as if mocking Crockett's career and her service was entertainment. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some gasping, others whispering. The anchors at the desk froze, their pens hanging in midair. Everyone could sense the edge in Barron's tone. It was sharper now, cutting not just at Crockett, but at the dignity of the office she represented. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Instead, she leaned in ever so slightly, her expression calm, her tone deliberate, her words wrapped in a quiet confidence that carried more weight than Barron's bravado ever could. "Do you really want to know what unfit looks like?" she asked, her voice slicing through the tension with surgical precision. The studio fell silent. Even Barron blinked, caught off guard by the steadiness of her delivery. He expected a defensive scramble, an angry rebuttal. What he got instead was a poised challenge. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She let the silence between her words hang heavy, pulling the audience closer with every pause. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and the cameras zoomed tighter, capturing the unmistakable contrast, the entitled arrogance of Barron Trump against the measured calm of Jasmine Crockett. Barron tried to recover, waving his hand dismissively. "We've all heard your speeches before, Congresswoman. Spare us the theatrics." But his words didn't land the same way. His tone carried a tinge of unease, as though even he realized he had walked into something he couldn't control. Crockett's gaze didn't break. She wasn't defending herself anymore. She was laying a trap, and Barron was walking straight into it. Each second stretched longer than the last, the tension thick enough that even the anchors began glancing at one another as if bracing for what was about to happen. Narrator. The balance was shifting, and everyone could feel it. Barron's smirk began to falter, his interruptions coming quicker, more forced. "Look, nobody here takes you seriously. You're a freshman voice, that's all. People like you don't last in real politics." His voice cracked just enough to betray the unease. Crockett's reply was almost a whisper, yet it carried across the studio with the clarity of conviction. "Funny, because I brought receipts." And that was the moment. The words weren't shouted, but they cut deeper than any insult hurled in her direction. The audience stiffened, waiting, leaning forward. Even Barron, for the first time that night, looked unsure of what to say next. Cliffhanger. And then Crockett pressed play. The silence stretched, heavy and electric. Crockett's words funny, because I brought receipts hung in the air like a storm about to break. Every camera tightened its lens, every anchor froze in their chair, and every viewer at home leaned just a little closer to their screen. And then, without raising her voice, Jasmine Crockett reached for the small tablet placed beside her notes. With a single tap, the studio speakers crackled alive. At first it was Barron's voice, unmistakable. The arrogance was there, dripping from every syllable. "These people don't get it," his recorded voice sneered. "They work night and think they understand the system. Please. Politics isn't for them. It's for people like us. People who know how to win." The room gasped. It wasn't just arrogance. It was contempt. In one sentence, he had mocked the very Americans he claimed to represent. The clip continued, his laughter echoing. "Unfit? Half of Congress is unfit. But as long as you've got the right name, the right money, you're untouchable. That's the game." The audience shifted, murmurs turning into audible disbelief. The anchor sat frozen, eyes darting between Crockett and Barron. For the first time all evening, Barron Trump's face was stripped of its smug composure. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed. But no words came out. Crockett let the recording play just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. Then she pressed pause, her calm gaze never leaving him. "Unfit," she said softly, but her voice carried like thunder. "Fitness isn't about last names. It's not about privilege or inheritance. It's about service. It's about standing in the courtroom with families who can't afford a voice. It's about fighting for the single mother who works 2 jobs and still gets denied her dignity. That's fitness. That's what this country deserves." The studio erupted not in applause, but in stunned silence so complete it was deafening. Every breath, every blink, every shifting chair was audible. And in that silence, Crockett's words rang louder than any insult Barron had thrown. She leaned forward, her tone steady, measured, devastating. "You want to talk about unfit? Unfit is mocking the very people who make this country run. Unfit is thinking that democracy is a game, that leadership is a prize you inherit. Unfit is forgetting that power without service is nothing but vanity." Barron's mouth opened, but nothing came. The cameras caught it all, the flicker of panic, the stutter before the silence. The weight of a young man realizing he had been dismantled not with anger, but with truth. Narrator, this wasn't just a comeback. It was the collapse of entitlement. And then it began the reaction, the tidal wave. Even before the studio could cut to commercial, phones lit up across the country. Clips of the recording of Barron's face paling, of Crockett's razor-sharp line, "Fitness isn't about last names. It's about service," spread like wildfire. On Twitter, hashtags exploded. Hashtag Crockett receipts, hashtag unfit exposed, hashtag Barron silenced within minutes. The phrases trended worldwide. Memes were born in real time. Side-by-side screenshots of Barron's smug smirk against his stunned silence. Captions, reading from unfit to outclassed. TikTok loops replayed the recording with remixes and voiceovers. Instagram Reels captured the moment. Crockett leaned in, eyes unshaken, as though carrying the weight of every working-class American on her shoulders. And the anchors. They were frozen in place, caught between journalistic neutrality and human disbelief. One whispered wow into a hot mic. Another pressed her pen so tightly into her notebook the paper tore. The studio cameras swung back to Barron, hoping for a rebuttal. But there was nothing. No rehearsed talking point, no clever comeback. Just silence and arrogance unraveling in real time. Crockett, still calm, gave him one final glance before turning back to the anchors. "The people of this country deserve better than insults and inheritance. They deserve leaders who serve, not heirs who sneer. And if standing up for them makes me unfit in your eyes, then I will wear that word as a badge of honor," was the final blow. It's not shouted, but spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who knew she had just shifted the ground beneath her opponent's feet. The audience, the anchors, even the viewers at home, everyone could feel it. A moment had been captured, a myth dismantled, a line crossed from which Barron Trump could not return, and as Crockett placed the tablet back on the table, Barron sat frozen, as the hashtags continued to climb and the clips went viral mid-broadcast. The narrator's voice cut in, solemn and unshaken. "Narrator, this wasn't just a debate. This wasn't just a rebuttal. This was the collapse of entitlement. And outside the studio, the aftershocks were just beginning." Cliffhanger, and outside the studio, the aftershocks were just beginning. As the studio lights dimmed, but the echoes of that recording and Crockett's words had already spilled far beyond the walls of the broadcast. By the time the debate ended, the world outside was on fire. Twitter-now X was the first to erupt. Within minutes, #Crockett exposes Barron. Shot to the top of the trending charts, eclipsing sports, entertainment, and even breaking news. The clip of Barron's own words, "Politics isn't for them, it's for people like us," was replayed, dissected, and looped across millions of feeds. Comment after comment poured in. Jasmine Crockett didn't just answer, she annihilated. "Entitlement met receipts tonight, unfit. Look in the mirror, Barron." And then came the memes. One viral image plastered Barron's stunned expression side by side with Crockett's calm, resolute face captioned simply, "Confidence versus competence." Another showed a sinking ship labeled "Entitlement," with Crockett drawn as the iceberg. TikTok's layered his recording over dramatic slow-motion footage. Turning his downfall into a cinematic meme, the cultural moment snowballed as late-night comedians seized the opportunity. On one show, the host opened with Barron's recorded words, pausing dramatically before deadpanning, "Ladies and gentlemen, America's future leader, brought to you by nepotism." Another joked, "If fitness is last names, then I guess the Kardashians should run the Pentagon." Laughter thundered, but beneath it was a sharp sting of truth. Meanwhile, political pundits dove in, parsing every second of the exchange. Panels replayed Crockett's delivery, pointing out her composure, her timing, the way she let silence hang before delivering her blows. One commentator declared, "This wasn't just a clapback. This was a masterclass in political storytelling." Crockett reframed the entire definition of leadership in under 2 minutes. But the ripple didn't stop there. Celebrities joined in, amplifying the moment to their millions of followers. Musicians, actors, athletes' voices that rarely enter politics praised Crockett's courage. One actress tweeted, "This is the energy we need. Come smart, fearless." A Grammy-winning singer posted the clip with the caption, "Receipt season is open." Grassroots activists, too, saw themselves in her words. Community organizers and advocacy groups began stitching Crockett's lines into their own messaging. "Fitness isn't about last names. It's about service." The phrase turned into a rallying cry, printed on shirts, hashtags, even protest. Signs within days, for working-class Americans, for immigrants, for those who felt overlooked. Crockett's moment was validation, a reminder that truth could still cut through privilege, and through it all, Barron Trump remained silent. His team scrambled, but the damage was already done. Every attempt to spin his words sounded hollow compared to the recording. The more they explained, the worse it seemed. Narrator, it wasn't just a debate. It became a cultural earthquake, a moment that peeled back the mask of entitlement and laid it bare for the world to see. Clips replayed on news loops, headlines declared his arrogance exposed, and hashtags rolled on like wildfire. Yet in the midst of the memes, the laughter, the viral edits, a deeper current began to flow. Commentators asked harder questions. What does it mean when leadership is treated like inheritance? How much longer can arrogance overshadow service? Because behind the jokes and the viral content, people weren't just laughing. They were reflecting on privilege, on who gets to lead, on who carries the weight of everyday America. Cliffhanger, but buried in the laughter, a deeper truth began to surface. In the days that followed, the noise began to settle. The hashtags still burned brightly. The memes continued their endless circulation. But what lingered most was not the spectacle, it was the substance. Jasmine Crockett had taken an insult meant to diminish her and transformed it into a lesson that cut deeper than any headline. When she finally addressed the uproar directly, her tone was steady, not triumphant. "This was never about me versus him," she said, her voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had stood in real courtrooms, defended real people, and borne the weight of real struggle. "This was about what leadership is supposed to mean in America. Leadership isn't a birthright. It isn't a last name. Leadership is service." Her words landed because they spoke to something universal. People across the country, from small towns to bustling cities, heard themselves in that framing. It wasn't about the noise of politics. It was about the dignity of representation. Crockett reminded them that those who step into public life should carry the voices of their communities, not the arrogance of their privilege. And then came the line that crystallized the moment into something timeless, the true measure of strength isn't who shouts loudest, but who stands tallest in truth. It was simple, but it reverberated far beyond the debate stage. For every American who had been talked over, underestimated, or dismissed, the sentence rang like a vindication. The narrator's voice cut in. "Power without empathy is hollow, but truth with conviction reshapes history." That was the heart of it. This clash, as viral and entertaining as it had been, was never just about a personal takedown. It was about reminding a nation that its future cannot be entrusted to arrogance or entitlement. It must be grounded in authenticity, in leaders who do not flinch when challenged, who see service as responsibility rather than spectacle. For immigrants chasing the American dream, for workers fighting to be heard, for communities long excluded, from the halls of power, Crockett's stand was more than a rebuttal. It was proof. Proof that dignity could still rise above mockery. Proof that truth could still puncture privilege. And yet, there was no illusion that the story was over. Because the fight she embodied, the fight for justice, for equality, for the soul of democracy, was bigger than one exchange, bigger than one recording. Narrator, this moment was a chapter, not the book, a spark, not the flame, because America's larger fight for justice is still being written. Cliffhanger. And this clash was only one chapter in America's larger fight for justice. The dust of the clash still lingered in the public conversation. Barron Trump had walked into that studio believing his insult would stick, that calling Jasmine Crockett unfit would reduce her to a soundbite. But instead, Crockett flipped the moment on its head. She transformed what was meant to wound into a lesson that inspired millions. She showed the nation that authenticity always outshines entitlement. That truth, when spoken with conviction, slices through arrogance like glass. What began as an attempt to humiliate became a reminder of what real leadership looks like. Calm in the storm, steady in conviction, unshaken by privilege. Narrator, America saw more than a takedown that day. It saw proof that dignity doesn't bend, that resilience doesn't break, and that arrogance, no matter how loud, cannot silence truth. And now, the choice falls to us, the audience, the people who felt that spark. Do we let the moment pass as entertainment, or do we carry its lesson forward? If you believe in leaders who serve rather than posture, if you believe in dignity over mockery, in truth over spin, if you believe that America's promise belongs to all of us, then this is your movement too. Subscribe now. Share this story and help amplify the voices that refuse to bow to arrogance. Because every click, every share, every voice adds to a chorus too powerful to ignore. Narrator's final words. Together, we write the next chapter of America's promise.